This time it's for real. and with microphone. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We still have Rebecca's playlist playing that will just enjoy a moment of the music. My name is Elizabeth East. I'm a director of LA Louver Gallery, and it is my pleasure this evening to introduce two extraordinary people who I've known each almost for 20 years, more than 20 years now, actually. But before we get into business, I just wanted to thank all of my colleagues at LA Louver, but especially this evening, Mimi King, Marie Darroch, and Lawrence Lee for their help in putting this event together. Thank you all. Also to say that we will be open for a short time after the conversation for those people who wish to stay and look at the paintings. But please come back. We're only in the first week of the show. It will continue through July 20th. And we are open special hours for summer, meaning Tuesday through Friday, 10 to 6, and Saturdays, 10 to 2. And we always validate your parking. Very important. So, first off, Rebecca Campbell, who I think needs no introduction, but I will give a brief one. Rebecca was born in Salt Lake City, Utah. She now lives in Los Angeles. We have known Rebecca since 2001, when she graduated from UCLA with an MFA. We have presented 7 exhibitions, this being the 7th. Rebecca's work is in public and private collections throughout the United States and Europe, notably in the US at LACMA, Laguna Museum of Art, Nora Eccles, the Phoenix Art Museum, amongst others. And I'm pleased to say that the Phoenix Art Museum played a particular role, and more especially Sara Cochran, who curated a stunning exhibition in 2011 that featured Rebecca's work alongside Angela Ellsworth called Seeing is Believing. And we have that catalog available. It was a beautiful show, and I'm pleased to say that one of the signature works in that is currently in the entryway, I think, of the Phoenix Art Museum. Yeah. So, first of all, thank you, Rebecca, for coming. But on to Sara with sort of short. Sara has a very distinguished resume. She received her master's from the Sorbonne in Paris, her PhD in the history of art from the Courtauld in London. She is a highly regarded teacher and writer and has held many curatorial positions. Early in her career, she was with the Guggenheim Museum, and LACMA. How could I forget LACMA? Okay, and more recently the Phoenix Art Museum, the Scottsdale Museum of Art, where she was also the director, and most recently the church at Sag Harbor. And I'm pleased to give a little bit of an advance notice for a show that she's curating, which I'm very intrigued about. Let me get this right. It is called Are You Joking? Women and Humor, which will open on June 23rd. At the church at Sag Harbor. So you have to travel quite a way, but I think that's also a testament as to how far Sara has traveled for this evening, and she has traveled all that way specifically for this event. So with that, I would like to ask all of you to welcome our guests.
Okay, I was told there was an on button, and I think I found it. So I would like to thank Rebecca so much for the work and also for the conversation this evening. Great thanks, obviously, to Elizabeth and Peter and everybody here at LA Louver, always doing remarkable work, and also to you for joining us. We all know how bad LA traffic is, so thank you, thank you, thank you. Rebecca, I would think a really nice place to start is with the title Young Americans. Music has been so important to your work. It has been so important to your paintings. And obviously, Young Americans is the name of an album by David Bowie, and also the name of a song that deals with sort of sexual frustration, but also with Nixon and also with McCarthyism. So it's, let's just say, a kind of meaty entrance place. It's also about a land of plenty. It's an Englishman's experience of the American dream. And so my question to you to start with is, where do you place that song in your own childhood and also within the childhood of your children?
Great question. I want to thank everyone, too. Thank you so much to everyone you mentioned, everyone at LA Louver, Elizabeth, Peter, Mimi, you, Sara. And I have to add my husband. Thank you, Todd. Young Americans, I like things that are work in multiple ways. So I had a show here called Poltergeist, which was about the sort of 1980s phenomenal movie, but also about German kitchen ghosts. So I am thinking about young Americans in the specificity that you mentioned, and also just as two words that exist together as an idea. And my own experience of young Americans was, you know, I was obsessed with David Bowie at 12 years old. But he was I was syncopated with the rest of the world because I was in Salt Lake City, Utah. So, you know, punk rock and those things reached us later. And so I sort of see a lot of things as existing outside of time in that way. And I saw him in particular as a symbol of possibility because I was growing up in a place that was quite the opposite. And particularly as a woman, there were so many limitations put on me that I saw him as like a wildfire idea of what the world could be. And in particular, I think his ideas about gender and how slippery that was, and how I also like, in terms of naming things, the sculpture that's at the Phoenix Art Museum, the title of that is Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? After a Culture Club song. And I ran that title by my studio assistant at the time, and he said, "That's the dumbest idea I ever heard. Why would you do that?" And I like things because there was, you know, there is just gatekeeping everywhere, but my life involved a lot of it. And I like things that can just slice through the high and the low. And so for me, there are some pretty big, heavy ideas to think about in terms of young Americans, especially right now. I mean, seriously. What a difficult time to be a young American and try and define what that means. But it also is very danceable, right? Like there's another part of it which is sort of joyful and liberating and rock and roll. So I'm interested in both of those sides of the coin.
And do your children, how do they relate to you as somebody who knows and is interested in music? Is that a cultural bridge or is that a cultural divide?
Well, a perfect example of this would be the painting in the back room in Utero. That is my 16-year-old Angus, who looks a lot like me, who acts a lot like me, and who can't stand to be next to me right now because he's 16 years old. He is playing, I did a performance that was part of this body of work at the studio that involved his band. And they played the Pixies, they played Squeeze, they played their own tunes. And I like the idea, and I think painting, this is a longer conversation, but I think painting is uniquely situated to deal with the complexities of time and the non-linear nature of time. And I think that work that's good, music that's good, ideas that are important cycle around. And so my husband is a musician, my mother was a musician, so music is always just a huge factor in my life, and I kind of think through music. And if you think of, Claude Debussy, certainly they're not playing that on, every radio station right now, but it means a new thing right now to listen to Clair de Lune. That is still relevant. And to me, it's still relevant that he plays Dumb by Nirvana. One of the lines in that is, he's cutting himself on angel hair and baby's breath. And the kids are cutting themselves on everything. And so for me, it's a way we can communicate, but it also illustrates the distance between us because he is not me. And part of the intention in the way I have sort of placed this work conceptually is to talk about the gaze in particular, and to talk about the very rich, fertile intellectual discourse that has largely gone unnoted, I think, that exists in not only the fact that I am a female maker looking at things, but I'm looking at things that used to be me, that were my body, that now exist outside of me. And so this kind of feedback loop that is created, the gaze, I think, has always sort of involved a conversation about distance and the other. But I think there is another conversation to be had that is about the connection and about the collapse of the other. That was a little off topic, but that's how we think about music.
I don't think that's at all off topic, because I think that just as music is a time machine, it would seem to me that in your paintings there is also a time machine. And I want to talk about the grid behind us, but before we do, I have a question about the greenhouse, which is the painting on the far wall. If we think about one of your first shows here, Poltergeist, you entered through the front door that was your parents' front door. And I'm interested in the space of, is it 15 years of shows that you have gone from painting about your parents' house and your childhood to painting about your family home with Todd and with your children. Yeah. So there is that time machine of the back and forth. But what I'm really interested in the greenhouse is the way you have placed the children as part of the house, but also very individual, sort of very individually posed within it. And then also the break into abstraction that both distances and also breaks down the idea that of the image of the house. I don't know if that was a question.
Yeah, it was great. And you're so intuitive. You really, that is a very important painting for exactly those reasons. I think you would be interested to know that so it's been 24 years that I've been painting about these things. And in my very first show at LA Louver, I made a painting exactly that size, the exact dimensions, and it was called Discipline, and it was a painting of the back of my parents' house. And the way I came up with this image, I was just sitting in the backyard, and there was this sort of magical light emanating out of the family room, and so I took a photograph. And a few days later, I was looking at the photograph, and it struck me that the composition was almost identical to the painting that I had made 20 years ago. And that painting, if you'll indulge me, this is a little bit of a story, but I had made that painting right after seeing, there was a Mondrian show at MoMA that was really remarkable, and it was organized chronologically, And I had not had a Mondrian moment. I was sort of like, yeah, it's nice, you know? and then I saw the show, and I was just, you know, it was a breathtaking show. But one of the interesting things about it was, because it was arranged chronologically, you know, we think of Mondrian as this like slice of rigor, this one moment in his practice in which we can kind of essentialize him in a particular way. But this show started with these like extravagantly beautiful cubist tree paintings that then evolve and break down into these more severe grid structures. They become radically minimal at some point, super severe in the way they're painted, and then they don't stop there. They continue on, and their journey turns, as I understand it, by the time he paints Boogie Woogie Broadway, you have like the Harlem Renaissance and jazz, and he's excited about the grid falling apart. Also, what's happening is his body is falling apart. He's no longer able to demand of the object the same rigor. So instead, he embraces it. And Boogie Woogie Broadway shimmers, and it has this kind of groove in it, and the cubes are smaller, and the color and the paint handling is looser. So I was thinking about discipline, and I love a manifesto. I love them. They're ridiculous, but I think they're fun. They're ridiculous, right? Like, we don't do manifestos anymore because we're in a new place of discourse. I was raised in a community and a house where discipline and rigor was hardcore, like dangerously so. And that painting of the back of my parents' house was a mid-century modern. It was very clean. The windows were red, yellow, and blue, which is why it was an ode to Mondrian, based on the grid of a column and the deck. And within those windows were figures, and in one room there was a little girl buried under the bed, hiding under the bed. And I was exploring these ideas about the beauty and the limitations of rigor and reduction and sort of authoritarian ideas in art. So, and comparing that to how I was raised. So, get to this painting. What I realized first and foremost was, instead of a primary color scheme, my house and what I had taken in this image was a secondary color scheme. So it was purple and green and orange. And those are the polluted colors. They're not pure. You have to mix them. They only come from being polluted with another color. And that is the life that I live. And that's the life that I've raised my children in. And the house that we live in is in a really loud neighborhood with a lot of sirens and a lot of wires and a lot of intense and mariachi bands and car accidents. And it's exciting and rich, and you can always smell something. And the house is 115 years old, and it's got 4 different kinds of shingles on it. And you see in the house and in the children, not only is the child not buried under the bed, he's painting you. He has a different kind of position. And the abstraction, to your point, I think, for one thing, they're trees. They're closer to you. And I feel, obviously, that the things that are closest to us are the most difficult to comprehend and to wrap our brains around because we're inside them. They're also the most viscerally, evocative. And so the abstraction was also, they're also kind of scary. They look like they might eat you. And the reference here is Richter, very different practice. Somebody who won't make any definitive statements about the work, who won't pick a practice, who is pushing the edges. And that is, for better or worse, the world that my kids are being raised in is one much more of questions than of answers.
It would seem to me that the way you've always kind of straddled this realism and abstraction has radically changed. It would seem to me in a painting like this, it is about pushing boundaries, whereas if I think about a painting like Daughter Daddy Date, she's standing in the background on this Persian rug, and then the polished floor, which is exquisite, but it becomes this almost impassable area of vertiginous sloshes of color. And I'm interested in the way that boundary in that painting, which I think comes from this period of much greater control, is much more a kind of barrier, whereas here it is something which is just much more about the life within the work.
That's a very interesting point, thinking about that painting in particular. Abstraction has always been a huge interest and part of my practice. And something, the art world does love its boxes. And, if you see a painting like this, people, might sort of, why don't you do more figuration, realistic figuration? And I have had people push on both sides of the spectrum. Why is there a figure in this work when it's so much? And to me, one of the most beautiful things about painting in particular is, we're human beings. We're so tender and vulnerable, and we're dying the minute we're born. We are vulnerable things. And so, and yet we have the ability to conceive of the invulnerable. So, like, for instance, infinity. We come up with a mathematical equation for the infinite in a body that has to deal with the reality of deteriorating and death. And for me, painting as a practice, you get to take an idea, and that is the sort of pure thing, and you throw it through the body. And I don't see that as a limitation. I see that as the magic. And so you threw it through the body, and the body has its own intelligence and its own way with it, and distorts it into a different experience, which then you end up with an object, which is sort of an artifact of the connection and the distance between the brain and the body. And so abstraction is that force for me. And I have, when I was younger, I really had to fight, because I was in kind of a real intellectually repressive environment, for the brain. I had to sort of like insist on, going to college, things like that. So I was very, I was rigid about that part of my practice. But weirdly, as I've gotten older, I've found I often have to defend the body. And the intelligence of the body and experience and viscerality and intuition and guts and all of the sort of messiness of life. So that painting was the hardest painting I have ever made to date, technically speaking. And I was sort of, all the abstract passages have to be done wet in wet, which means that if it begins to dry, it develops a skin over the top, and if you re-enter the paint, it just gets boogery and doesn't function correctly. So at that scale, and there's no studio assistance, this is like a very organic practice. So at one point I was in the middle. I had been working for hours and hours and up to my neck in paint and scaffold and huge table full of wet paint. And Todd came into the studio like 5 or 6 at night and just looked at me and said, "You're not coming home, are you?" And it's exhilarating to, and I mean, it sounds melodramatic, but it's really hard. It takes a great deal of courage to throw yourself into the unknown in a way that there's financial consequences, the consequences of not being home when I'm supposed to be home to take care of my kids and stuff like that. So and also that's about death. I mean, in a way that allowing the sort of body of the paint to speak is allowing the unknown to take up a big part of the conversation, or not the unknown, but the that cannot be named or controlled or fully understood, or maybe controlled by language.
It's just interesting, in 2011, when we did Seeing is Believing, one of the things you mentioned was the idea of motherhood as the last taboo in painting, because of its link to nostalgia, because of certain ideas of perhaps an overreach into sweetness and saccharine, or at least the fear of that. It is interesting to hear you talk about your process in such a visceral and viscous way, just hearing kind of the reverberation of that previous conversation, because motherhood has been central to your experience in life, and I think motherhood has been central in many ways to your painting.
I mean, all you have to do is think, not that you want to, but how babies are born. This is not a sort of tepid, dainty, this is a blood and guts situation. And motherhood itself is profoundly complex. And the discourse that has existed around it is just largely patriarchal bullshit. And it needs to be rewritten. And the problem is a lot of that has come from just silencing women who have kids by not giving them representation, or they're not in collections. There's a real just practical problem with that voice not being present in the discourse, or I think it would be corrected quickly, because I hesitate to go there because I don't want to cry right away. The painting here on the right of my daughter Andromeda is, I didn't plan there to be two figures in that painting. And that painting, I use Photoshop a lot to change scale, and these are all from photographs that I've taken, but there are often multiple photographs that have been put together to create which is why they have kind of an uncanny, weird, uncomfortable perspective to them. So I was moving the figures around and doing different things, and I was combining two spaces literally together, and two figures ended up in this image. And all of a sudden it came, obviously, to me that that was the painting. And that is the painting because Andromeda was a twin. And we lost Andy's sister. And you could sentimentalize that image. You could say that, and the image is actually, so my response to the place that I was raised in, the kind of rigid religion that was sort of imposed on me, was made me very, my reaction to that was to become just very adamantly logic-based person. And my 16-year-old, who's reading Deleuze, I was telling you, has challenged me on my own sort of full stop on that. And he has asked me to reconsider ideas about magic and ideas about the other, the after, the different, the unknowable. And so I had an experience where I was at Disney Hall, concert hall, at a Bulgarian women's choir concert, which is, I highly recommend if you ever have the opportunity. It's so fantastic. And we had two very quick martinis at the intermission. So we were in kind of a rosy space, went back and had one of those quintessential transcendent spiritual experiences in which I was lifted up from this place into a different place. And that might sound woo-woo, but in that place, I thought there is a mathematical probability of parallel universes. And in those universes, everything is happening. Everything that can happen is happening. And in one of them, Joe and my mother still there. And so this painting is sort of about that experience. And you could wrap that up into some sort of, the mom and her story about her experience with her. I don't care. It was a profound experience for me that I think is about math and reality and feminism and death and by the way, she's wearing my wedding dress. That's my wedding dress. And so there is this, again, thinking about the gaze and how much I'm projecting, especially on a girl, right? Like, she's not here tonight. I wish she were. She does not wear dresses. She's not interested in dresses. And yet there is this sort of echo, like a ripple in a pool where it's related to you. It is a piece of you. You're connected to it. But it is not you. So the figuring of that, I think, is very rich intellectual discourse that you can talk about. And in particular, when people say nostalgia, to clarify, nostalgia comes from the Greek root nostos, which means nostos, and what's the other little bit of it? Essentially what it means is to return home to survive. And that is not, I think, fluff at all. I think that is like a way to deal with the sublime. It is a way to hold death and sublimity and rapture at the same time. And I think nostalgia, weirdly, some of the discourse, particularly around that, is quite sexist because it minimizes the weight and gravity of comfort as being unimportant intellectually to us as human beings. And I certainly wouldn't land only on comfort, but it should be a part of the conversation. That idea of returning home to survive. It isn't returning home to borrow $20 from your parents. It's for survival.
The other interesting thing about nostalgia was it was defined in a moment of war, and it was defined for, I believe, Swiss soldiers who could no longer fight because they wanted to go home.
Right.
And again, it is interesting to think about just the genderization of where that word has come to now. And I'm interested in what you've been talking about, these kind of perhaps more spiritual journeys. If we were to talk about Wolf Moon, that is obviously a work that deals with an idea of the supernatural, an idea of a closeness to nature that is not an urbanized, although it's an urban area, but it is a very different performative relationship with the night, with water, and with this wolf moon. It does appear to perhaps think about a spiritual life or perhaps a future.
You are very perceptive. Yeah, and it's a diptych intentionally because it's about being split. It's about being in two places, and there's two moons. And if you notice, on the right panel, there's no telephone wires, and on the left panel, there are telephone wires. So that telephone wire is from, I shot the wolf moon from my backyard and straight through the telephone wires. This is also, so it's my backyard, but it is also the Salmon River, which is in Oregon, which is where that fireplace is. And our family in particular, is split between sort of the desire to just go off the grid and disappear into the wilderness. And also, I mean, I was raised on the side of a mountain. So many advantages to having a stream in the backyard, but a lot of disadvantages because, you know, intellectually kind of a desert. It can be, and a dangerous place if you don't fit into a particular community in a particular way. So this is sort of about the two worlds of Los Angeles and the Salmon River, the two worlds of life and beyond life, the awake life, dream life, and the spiritual or the fantastical and the completely ordinary. The figure in the right is my son Rory, who has just declared that he's going to be an NBA basketball player. He's decided. So I'm holding that, and he does a lot of jumping and a lot of shooting of hoops in my life. And the way I took that image was I just lit the backyard, and I gave him this fabric to play with. And I was like, do something, Rory. And that's what he did. And it was so beautiful. And if you're present, so much of what exists around us all of the time is just transformatively meaningful. And so this is sort of about that too. He's just doing a very simple thing, and yet I see that as magic. And I don't know how to define magic, but I think I'm sort of know it when I see it.
I think we should come back to the extraordinary series of portraits behind us, all the young Americans. I would like you to talk a little bit about your process, because I find it very interesting that you work with photography, but there is a freshness to the way they're represented because there's almost a spontaneity. Obviously in your process, as you're painting it, you know, your great use of color, your amazing kind of underpinning of your works with color, but also in how, as we look at these teenagers, young adults, some of them still betray that childlikeness that's not so far ago or so long ago, and some of them are sort of starting to look like the adults that they will become. And I wonder how much that is really intentional upon your part.
Yeah. I'll answer a little bit of the formal question first. So Greenhouse just took a pound of flesh. I mean, so did this painting. Just extraordinary labor. It took a long time. It was very slow to reward. And the ideas were slow to develop. So I could paint about this much of the leaves per day. And that's not the lemons, that's nothing else. And so I did a little patch, because I thought, maybe. And I was like, oh, it looks great, I have to do this. But so much time, an extraordinary amount, and every day taking a little photograph. Do you think it's gonna work? Because I've done paintings like that and had to scrape the entire thing down afterward. And so you make this investment and you reap a certain reward. This series, I had made the rest of the work. This was the very last thing I did, were these portraits. And I thought about doing another big painting. I knew I wanted something else for the show, but I thought, I want to do something that I can play inside formally, that I can really push, and that I can allow a lot of exciting formal things to happen. You could, on one hand, you could say portraits are pretty boring and rote and old-fashioned. On the other hand, Jawlensky, go to the Norton Simon and look at those heads, and they are as relevant and interesting and fresh and inventive as ever. And so for me, the head has always been sort of like a blank slate to be able to try things. And I don't, whether it's because I can't or I won't, I don't ever really know what a painting's gonna look like at the end. So you'll notice that some of these paintings have a much more kind of pictorial quality, and the flesh is sort of more polished and finished. And then some of them are pretty close to the first pass, that they have very little paint on them, they're more expressive. You know, I'm a big fan of like the Blau Reiter and all of those sort of expressionist-oriented painters. And so I wanted to embrace that and allow, but the thing about form is it never exists for me without content and without narrative. So paint often relieves me of the kind of limits of my own narrative and makes things more complex and interesting. So an example of this would be in this corner, the upper corner is my son Angus. And if you're curious at all, there's a little film on my Instagram that shows the process of this painting. And it was the most difficult one with the most incarnations. And the very first one was similar to the painting below it, very fresh and bright and brushy. And for some reason, I just was like, yeah, it doesn't resolve him. And so I pushed it, and then it went too far, and then it got really muddy, and then it got very realistic. And then I was playing around in Photoshop, and I was like, I'm just gonna paint that out. I hate it. So I took gray, I just took gray paint and put it all over every part I didn't like. And I was like, that suits him. He's 16, and he has, I just said this to you, I'll repeat it. He sort of has, his brain is like the engine of a 747 with the brakes of a bicycle. So he's very intense. And so sometimes the control is because if he allows his emotions to fall out, he'll lose control of himself. And so he has, and I think a lot of 16-year-old boys have this kind of intense emotionality to them, and then the culture that they're raised in is sort of constantly sort of beating them up for that or whatever. So the gray obviously becomes this wonderful conversation about gender, about age, and about his personality specifically. And I never would have planned that or predicted that. The paint was like, here, let me help you out. Let's make this painting more interesting. So there's that. In terms of the ages of the kids, everyone here is between, my daughter is 12, my next son is 14, and my oldest son is 16. So everyone's between 12 and 16. Those are the years. And I don't know if this is true, but my best friend is a writer, and she told me that we often, I don't know if any of this is true, somebody should fact check me, but apparently when you think about butterflies going into the cocoon, you know, I always thought of them as like growing wings on the caterpillar, and then they're butterflies, but apparently that's not what they do. They liquefy and reform into new creatures. They don't just grow wings. And she explained this to me when I was talking about my 16-year-old, and she said he's not just growing wings on his brain right now. It's liquid in there. It's all going to a totally new land. And I think that's true, because he sort of came out the other side, another person, and he had the unbearable challenge of going through puberty in a house, locked in a house with his family and no friends because it was the pandemic. And it was painful to watch. And so much happens in those years. They do turn from children into adults. And you see Kyler, this is Kyler, and he's in his school polo still, and he's got this graceful, long delicate neck, and you can tell he's on the younger side of things, and he still doesn't swear as much, and he's like more innocent. And then you look at Alex, and he's a man. He's like a man, right? And it's so breathtaking to watch that. I mean, what could be more fascinating to watch than a human being changing from one thing into a wholly other thing? It's a privilege to be able to watch, and being able to do it, to do it again and again and again was a lot of nuance came out of that. These two here are twins. And you can see, the difference in them. Like Tess is a little Jodie Foster, and Stella's, a little sorority girl. They're very different. And again, it's not anything you can plan. And I just caught them when I could because I didn't plan ahead. And it was sort of like, herding cats. We'd be at the probably watching a basketball game. And I'd be like, hey, stand there for 1 second. Can I take your photograph? And, and it was in life that these photographs came in their natural environment where they were. And that was kind of beautiful too, because they weren't expecting it. I wasn't expecting it. And there's not, all of the photography sessions are like 5 minutes, maybe. Just sort of stand here, stand over there, let me try and get okay light, and that's it. So it's not like a long, drawn-out, intentional process. I'm allowing for a lot of spontaneity.
I do want to open it up to questions, but just before I do that, sorry, Edward, I have one question. Yeah. Have the sitters seen their portraits, and have any of them been very upset?
They have all seen them. And to my knowledge, none have been very upset. I don't know that they would tell me. So all of their parents have seen them. The opposite has been true. And I think, I mentioned this earlier too, and I'll mention it again. Like, these are not, I'm a big fan of Alvin Albright, but these are not that. There are a lot more zits in real life than there are up here, right? There's a lot more BO. And my intention was to look in a more oblique way at what they are at this moment, and not to define them by that kind of like, after school special kind of focus on those things. And so I'll tell you what Andromeda said, because my sister asked her on the night of the opening how she felt about it. And I might cry again. She said, well, when you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror and you think, I am ugly. I don't like that. And she said, well, when I saw this painting, I thought, maybe not everyone sees me like that.
Edward, I'd love for you to ask.
Rebecca, 2 questions. When you told us about how you I thought based on this friends that we see, yes, I was very close to series.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you ever ask
Just let me repeat the question so everybody heard it. The question is, there had been an assumption that these were portraits from real life, and he just asked, has there ever been somebody who, or do you have a practice of having people sit for you?
this is not a romantic answer. It's hard to get people to sit for you because people are very busy. So the people who sit for me are my kids. So I have a lot of work of my kids from life, but it's very difficult because these paintings take a long time. So to ask that of someone is a pretty big ask. I also find that I think photography, I tell this to my students, I think photography and painting, you should have to have a license like driving a car. And you should have to sort of know how to paint the figure without the photograph before you're allowed to use a photograph. Because what happens is all the breath falls out of it. And it ends up, it can be very like stodgy and airless and sort of, and that comes from being a slave to a technology. Being married to a photograph as a painter is like being married to a fax machine as like a technology specialist, right? Like cameras are very limited. Sorry for photographers in the audience, but cameras are very limited in what the technology of the camera just doesn't have any of the complexity that the eye has. I mean, a very simple example of that would be if you're taking a photograph of a house with the front door open in the bright day, but there's a figure inside the house, you can either expose for what's inside the house or what's outside the house, and you're either gonna blow one out or take the other one to black. And the eye, it just has no problem with that. And so with me, I've done so much, I taught figure painting from life and figure drawing from life for so many years that I'm able to infer a lot of what the back of the figure looks like. This is another, I'm going into teaching mode, but like a photograph deals with contour lines, right, all the time. If you look at the outline of my hand, and it's a photograph, this is what the photograph gives you is the outline, but contour lines are big fat liars because look, it's gone, right? There's no outline around the figure. The figure is something that exists in space that we as painters try to sort of wrangle with paint onto a flat surface. But I'm not so interested in the flat surface.
Talking about, there are two paintings. One is done by you, and probably years and years ago. One is just maximalism and another minimal.
Yeah.
Very labor intensive, but I hope you don't say it's a little bit laborious.
Very.
This piece looks like it was, and it's minimalistic. So when you start to work, do you know that's how you end up?
Yeah.
Do you know that's going to be so labor intensive, so maximalism, so minimalistic?
No, that's the short answer, is that I don't plan all of the formal elements, and you pick perfect paintings to talk about this. Both of these paintings are about Los Angeles, right? And this is my backyard, and I have a lemon tree that is just spastic. It just makes lemons like crazy. Like, it can't stop making lemons. And you pick all the lemons, and they come back. You pick them, they come back. And so when I was painting this, I'm very attached to land. Like I said, want to go off into the woods. But we live in the center of Los Angeles. So I wanted to find home here. I wanted to feel, and my sense of home is usually the land, the light, the smell. So I thought, okay, I'll start here. And one of the interesting things is, nothing in this painting is native. Nothing actually is from here. Palm trees, lemon trees, those are Icelandic poppies. None of those things come from here, which is sort of my experience of being here, is the reason that is so heavy and dense. For one thing, it's very beautiful. I was thinking a lot about the Klimt landscape paintings, and I was thinking about that kind of the pastoral but in this radically different context of a backyard in Los Angeles. And it needed the heaviness to communicate, which I didn't know at the time. It's an intuitive process where I'm like, the body is like, put a bunch of paint on, see what that does, make it heavier, make it more. And when I started to do that, the content that came out of that was this frenetic, intense, overwhelming quality of the city that we live in, which is beautiful, but also a little too much, right? I mean, it is a little too much here all the time. So it had to have that quality to express that idea. Then when I was painting this painting, which came from, actually, no, this is a few photographs put together. Is it? This might be the one painting that's one photograph. And this was, we were on spring break in Joshua Tree. And the house that we were in had, which many of you have probably experienced, it's a new phenomenon. You go stay somewhere and you're like, everything looks like a little picture for Instagram. There's a little place to stand and take your picture. And this is exactly what happened in the pool, was that sign was actually there behind the pool, and it was just hovering over Rory. And Rory just happens to be breathtakingly beautiful. He's also my, like, mama's boy, sweet, tender kid. But I worry all the time that Hollywood could ruin his life. It could also make his life. And the veneer, this is called Hollywood is a Sign. So it's a reference to Rocher. It's a reference, it's me thinking about language, the language of painting, text itself. And it had to be like glass. It had to be like Hollywood. It had to be a slow burn. It had to be polished like water. And so, did I plan that? No, but I let the body figure that out. The body knew how to say what I was trying to say about it. And it, after many, many years of painting, the advantage, I mean, there aren't a lot of advantages of being over 50, but one of them is, like a musician, you play scales, you play scales, you play scales, so you don't have to think about scales anymore. And at this point, my painting practice, the body is tuned to an extent that it does a lot of the work for me. It kind of knows how to bring the complexity and the narrative in.
Is that the sides of the paintings are colored? Is it the same color as the background? And also, it gives a glow to the painting, which adds a bit of subtlety. Could you comment on that?
Sure. They have auras, kind of, the paintings. Yeah. I pick those colors for two different reasons. One reason is I try and think about what kind of painting I want it to be. So if I want a painting to be very contrasty and full of energy, like this one, again, overwhelming, punch, 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 this painting. And as you'll see, the ground is orange and the primary color is green. So those are complements, which are constantly, gonna be exciting. And then if I want a painting to be more analogous, more chill, then I'm gonna pick a color that's close to the main color. So it's gonna be less of a fight and more of a sort of dance between the two. The other reason I pick is very like woo-woo again, which is I think about what's at the heart of the painting that might not actually be in the picture, but somehow lives at the heart of the painting and needs to be included.
There's one question here. This lady there's a microphone coming. She's right here. Okay, thank you.
I'm not a portrait person, but I have to say every single one of these portraits have such a dynamic vibration. So did you know, did you talk to any of these kids? Because they really speak out.
I know all these kids. All these kids were at the house in the last couple of weekends. And some of them I've known since they were 4 years old. So, Cooper's been Angus's best friend since they were in preschool. But again, I didn't plan any of that. I just allowed it. Yeah, the paint did.
Incredible.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a privilege. It's a weird space I feel a little, I'll just admit, I feel a little weird about painting the kids because it feels like I'm taking something, because they're so beautiful and they're so amazing, and I'm being allowed to paint them. And, it's not my place to tell each one of their stories, but I do want to honor them with my vision of them, and one thing I think is really great about the placement in this show is these as the end caps that face each other, because these are my kids, right? But each one of these kids has a life that complex and rich that looks totally different than my kids. And I wish I could make one for all of them, that they all have a kind of, what I hope for all of these paintings is that the narrative extends beyond the frame. That it doesn't end here, that you leave the painting wanting more and feeling that there is more that will come. And this is old-fashioned, but I think of these kind of albums, shows a whole album where they relate to each other and they're meant to create a bigger narrative. I think some of the best authors are often reintroducing a character in a weird way. You'll see a character pop up that only has maybe a few lines in a novel that was maybe a main character 2 novels before. And I think that's very different than what is encouraged by sort of, Instagram culture, which is sort of our attention span is so limited. But one of the things that I also found from spending time with these kids is, they're amazing. And we can talk about all the problems. There's all kinds of problems, but they are also fine. They're doing the thing. They're falling in love. They're playing music. They sit on the grass and laugh and do dumb things and, hit each other in the back of the head, just like we did. And they are. We should honor them in a way that sometimes is difficult because we're so worried about the world that they live in, but they're quite extraordinary. Thank you.
Perhaps we'll do one more question.
Hi.
Hi.
Is there a story to the dream painting?
The dream painting. That's Angus as a baby. And Angus, being a mother is a very hard thing. It's very difficult not to lose yourself completely because it's easy to do. And Angus used to, when he was little, he couldn't fall asleep without being right next to me. And I should preface this, I wasn't gonna have kids. If you asked me until the second I had kids, if I was gonna have kids, I would have said no. And then I was like, yes, let's have 3. And he, very intense kid, always. And he had to lay exactly next to me, and he had to twirl my hair in order to be able to fall asleep. Which, that sounds cute, is not. It's torture. It's like every night of your life. Imagine, 7 o'clock, go lay in the bed and get your hair twirled. It's intense. And Angus is also in the back room. And I won't go into detail, but Angus had a very hard year, a very dangerously hard year. And that painting in the back room is the light coming back. It's him sort of filling back up with light. And so those are the same boy, this light-filled boy who is still twirling, like intense, hard to hold, hard to contain, but so worth it, so worth it. So it was sort of a return for me to that. That is also him holding the hand of the little girl. And I saw in those two paintings all of the seeds of the tools that he would need to sort of hold the complexity of his life.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Ellie Louver. And thank you to you for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sara. Thank you so much for coming.